Elena Parker had always known that wealth could be as cold as it was intoxicating. She had married Richard Parker 12 years ago, drawn to his charm, his ambition, and the glittering lifestyle he promised. Over the years, she had carefully cultivated the image of the perfect wife, the hostess who never missed a charity gala, the attentive companion who smiled while he ranted about business, and the silent strategist behind many of his ventures. But today, standing in their sunlit penthouse living room, Elena realized all her efforts had counted for nothing. Richard, sitting in his oversized leather chair, glanced up at her with a smug grin, his gold watch gleaming under the morning sun. "You'll never touch my money again," he said casually, tossing a document onto the marble table as though it were a trivial trinket. Elena's eyes flicked to the contract, her hands tightening around the edges. It was a legal document transferring full control of the family fortune into Richard's name alone. Her name was conspicuously absent. Every clause, every line, had been crafted to erase her from the wealth she had helped build. Every penny now sailed off as if she had no claim to it at all. "Do you understand what this means?" Richard asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Elena nodded, keeping her expression carefully neutral. "Yes," she said softly, her voice steady despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. Richard leaned back, crossing his arms, the picture of smug confidence. "Good. I like that you understand. I've been more than generous. But from this point on, you have no say, no access, and certainly no control. This money is mine, and don't even think about challenging me." He chuckled, as if her mere existence in the room were inconsequential. Elena felt the familiar sting of humiliation, but instead of reacting, she took a deep breath and turned away. She walked to the window, staring out at the sprawling city below. Every skyscraper seemed to mock her, a reminder of the empire she had helped him build. And now, apparently, of how little he valued her. Her mind raced. Anger alone wouldn't serve her here. Impulsive retaliation would be useless. She had to think strategically, plan carefully. Richard had underestimated her, and that had always been his greatest flaw. By the time she retreated to her study, a quiet room filled with books and papers, Elena's plan had begun to take shape. She would not cry, she would not argue, and she certainly would not beg. This was bigger than money. It was about respect, dignity, and proving that underestimating her was a catastrophic mistake. She picked up a legal pad, already mapping out her next steps. Richard's arrogance had left cracks in his armor, gaps she could exploit. Every hidden account, every inflated expense report, every moment he had dismissed her contributions now became a weapon in her mind. Elena smiled faintly. There was a peculiar satisfaction in turning betrayal into strategy. Her anger had shifted into focus. She would play this long game with patience, precision, and an intelligence that Richard would never see coming. She whispered to herself, almost playfully, "He thinks he can keep me out. He has no idea I've been planning for this moment for years." And for the first time that morning, Elena felt something she hadn't felt in years. A quiet, confident fire. Richard might have tried to shut her out of his life, her finances, and his world, but he had only awakened the part of her that thrived on proving the impossible. The contract lay on the table, a symbol of his hubris, and Elena Parker, poised and calm, began to plot her victory, a victory that would leave no doubt as to who truly held power. Elena didn't sleep well that night. Her mind raced, replaying Richard's smug words over and over. "You'll never touch my money again." Every repetition fueled her resolve. She knew that the fight ahead wouldn't be won with anger or theatrics. It required strategy, patience, and meticulous planning. By the next morning, Elena had begun her quiet investigation. She started with the obvious, Richard's financial statements, and then moved to the less obvious, shell accounts. Hidden investments, offshore holdings, and business ventures he thought she wouldn't notice. She quickly realized just how careless he had been. His arrogance had blinded him. He had assumed she was naive, a woman content to sit quietly while he controlled everything. Elena's first call was to Maya, her lifelong friend and a financial analyst. "Maya," Elena said calmly over the phone, "I need you to look over every account, every investment, every unusual transaction Richard has made in the last 5 years. Are you serious?" Maya asked, sensing the fire in Elena's voice. "He's going to laugh if he ever finds out." "And the lawyers?" "Trust me," Elena interrupted, her voice firm. "He won't know until it's too late." Maya agreed, intrigued by Elena's determination. Over the next few days, the two of them dug through mountains of documents, cross-referencing bank statements, tax filings, and corporate records. Slowly, a pattern emerged: mistakes, shortcuts, and outright concealments that Richard had assumed would never be discovered. Elena's eyes sparkled as she realized how much power she could claim if she played her cards correctly. Next, Elena contacted Mr. Harris, a retired lawyer who had once been renowned for his courtroom cunning. They met in a quiet cafe, far from prying eyes. "Mr. Harris," Elena began, "I need advice. Not just legal advice, strategy." The old lawyer raised an eyebrow, studying her. "Strategy? Most people come to me in tears, expecting me to fight for them. You sound calm, dangerous even." "I'm calm because I've thought this through. Richard believes he's untouchable, that I'm powerless." "That's his mistake," Elena said. Mr. Harris chuckled softly. "All right. You have intelligence, evidence, and patience. Those are weapons stronger than anger. But remember, the courtroom isn't just about facts. It's about presentation, perception, and timing." Elena nodded. That very night, she began drafting a letter to the judge, carefully choosing her words. She didn't want an emotional outburst. She wanted wit, precision, and undeniable logic. The letter would outline Richard's arrogance, his hypocrisy, and subtly her own clever preparations to protect her interests. It was a chess move disguised as a simple letter, but it had the power to shift the entire game. While Elena worked, Richard remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing under his nose. He hosted lavish dinner parties, flaunted his wealth, and bragged to friends about how Elena would never touch a dime of his fortune. Each boast fueled her determination further. She didn't need to confront him yet. Patience was her ally. Late one evening, Elena sat in her study, candlelight flickering over her papers. The letter lay half-written, every word measured, every sentence crafted to make the judge see the truth while leaving Richard's arrogance exposed. She allowed herself a small smile. "He thinks this is over," she murmured. "Little does he know, the real game is just beginning." In that quiet moment, Elena felt a surge of power. The power of preparation, the power of intelligence, and most of all, the power of being underestimated. By the end of the week, the groundwork was laid. The evidence was organized, the letter refined, and her allies in place. Elena had turned Richard's carelessness into a weapon. She was ready to play her hand, but she would wait for the perfect moment, allowing him to stumble into his own trap. For the first time in years, Elena slept soundly, knowing that the fight ahead was no longer one she would lose. The morning of the hearing arrived with a crisp chill in the air. Elena adjusted the cuffs of her blazer and stepped into the courthouse, the polished floors reflecting her determined stride. She felt the familiar hum of anticipation in the hallway's reporters. Lawyers and curious onlookers were already gathering, whispering about the Parker divorce. Richard, as always, exuded confidence. He leaned casually against the doorway, perfectly dressed, his designer tie immaculate, his smirk smug and uncheckable. Elena's jaw tightened. She refused to let his arrogance rattle her. Every step she had taken to prepare for this moment had been meticulous. This was her arena now, and she intended to control every move. The courtroom filled quickly. Elena noted the curious glances from strangers who had heard of Richard's wealth but not much about her. Many assumed she would be an emotional, pleading figure, easy to dismiss. How wrong they would be. Richard rose first when the proceedings began. "Your Honor," he began, voice smooth and assured, "my wife has never contributed to the business, nor has she demonstrated any understanding of finance. She is not entitled to access my money, and her claims are absurd." He glanced at Elena, allowing his smirk to linger as if daring her to respond. Elena's lawyer, a sharp and composed woman named Clara, stepped forward and presented the documents Elena had gathered. The evidence was meticulous, accounts Richard had tried to hide, financial discrepancies he assumed were invisible, and contracts Elena had carefully compiled over months. Each document revealed not only Richard's attempts to exclude her, but also his arrogance and carelessness. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs, but Richard waved it off, confident. "Preposterous," he said, leaning back, fingers steepled in mock contemplation. "These are minor technicalities. Nothing of substance." Elena said nothing. She didn't need to. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Richard's performative arrogance, making her appear composed and uncheckable. Every eye in the room began to shift, noticing the quiet strength she exuded. Finally, Clara reached for an envelope sitting neatly on the corner of her table. She handed it to the judge. "Your Honor, Miss Parker has submitted this letter for your consideration. I believe it provides crucial context regarding her position." Richard laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "A letter? Really? She thinks a note can change anything?" He whispered to his attorney, clearly amused. Elena allowed a small, nearly imperceptible smile. The judge broke the seal and began reading. The room quieted instantly. Even Richard's chuckle faded as he realized the letter was different. It was poised, clever, and precise. While the judge scanned the first lines, Elena's mind worked like a silent engine. Every phrase had been carefully constructed to highlight Richard's hypocrisy, his greed, and, subtly, the fact that she had legally protected her own interests. There was no anger, no whining, only wit, intelligence, and undeniable evidence of his arrogance. Richard shifted in his seat, sensing the change. His confident posture wavered slightly as the judge's eyes flicked up from the page, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Elena noticed, a small victory in itself. The room held its breath. Spectators leaned forward. The tension was palpable. For years, Richard had underestimated Elena, assuming her silence equaled weakness. But now, in this moment, that very underestimation was beginning to unravel. Elena remained still, her expression serene. As the courtroom watched the first cracks appear in Richard's carefully constructed facade. He had mocked her, dismissed her, and assumed victory, but he was now facing something he had never anticipated. A woman who had outsmarted him at every turn. Armed not with anger, but with intelligence and patience, and deep down, Elena knew the moment of reckoning was approaching. The letter was only the beginning. The courtroom grew silent as the judge carefully unfolded Elena's letter. The paper was crisp, the handwriting neat, but the words contained a force far greater than mere ink on paper. Elena watched from her seat, her fingers folded calmly in her lap as Richard leaned forward, curious and still arrogantly unconcerned. Though there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes he did not want to admit. The letter began politely, almost demurely, thanking the court for its time and patience. But within the first paragraph, the tone shifted, not with anger, not with desperation, but with sharp, precise wit. Elena recounted Richard's long history of dismissing her contributions, his constant belittling, and his reckless handling of financial matters. every sentence highlighted, an irony that the courtroom could not ignore. The man who claimed absolute control over wealth had repeatedly relied on Elena's insight and expertise to grow it. For years, she wrote, I have been accused of incompetence, yet the investments I suggested doubled in value, while those made without my counsel faltered spectacularly. I am reminded daily that my insight is invisible until convenient, and my intelligence conveniently underestimated. The judge paused for a moment, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The letter's tone was unexpected, calm yet cutting, humorous yet damning. Elena could almost feel the judge's eyes scanning the room, the weight of the words settling in. Richard's smirk faltered. He leaned closer to his attorney and whispered, What? Is this a joke? His voice was low but tense. For the first time that morning, he seemed unsettled. Elena continued, her mind moving ahead even as the courtroom reacted. The letter subtly hinted at her own preparations, legal protections she had set up without Richard's knowledge, accounts he could not touch, investments fully under her name. She didn't reveal details, only enough to show that she was no longer powerless, that his attempts to control her finances were already obsolete. You may have tried, she wrote, to declare that I will never touch your money again. Yet the law and careful planning ensure that this assertion is nothing more than a boastful illusion. The courtroom murmured. Spectators exchanged glances, sensing the shift in energy. Even Richard's attorney seemed to tighten uncomfortably, as if realizing the tide had turned. Elena's letter then struck at the heart of Richard's arrogance. She described his casual boasts at parties, the way he flaunted wealth while dismissing her abilities, and the irony of thinking that she would quietly accept exclusion. She wrote with humor, poking fun at his overconfidence without ever descending into insult. It is amusing, she wrote, to witness the certainty with which one can be proven wrong while believing one is unassailable. By the time the judge had finished the first page, a small chuckle escaped his lips. It was subtle at first, almost hidden behind his hand, but it grew steadily as he read on. Elena's eyes followed him carefully, noting each flicker of amusement. She allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. She didn't need to gloat. The letter was doing all the work. Richard's face turned red. He had thought this would be a simple hearing, a demonstration of his dominance. Instead, he was confronted with the truth of his underestimation. Elena was clever, prepared, and unshakably composed. She had turned his own arrogance into a weapon against him, and he had no defense. The judge set the letter down momentarily, shaking his head with disbelief. Miss Parker, he said, trying to suppress a laugh, this is remarkably well written and remarkably true. Richard opened his mouth to argue, to insist it was mere theatrics, but no words came. The courtroom had shifted, all eyes now on him. Not Elena. The smirk he had relied on for so many years was gone. Replaced by the faintest shadow of panic. Elena remained calm, almost serene, letting the letter speak for her. Every word, every carefully chosen phrase, had landed exactly as intended. Richard's overconfidence was exposed. The courtroom's attention was hers. And the first cracks in his armor had begun to show. This was only the beginning. The courtroom was silent, hanging on every word as the judge continued reading Elena's letter. Each line cut through Richard's confidence like a scalpel. The judge's fingers traced the sentences carefully, pausing occasionally to reread particularly clever passages. Elena remained perfectly still, her composure unbroken. A calm island amid the storm she had orchestrated. Richard leaned forward in his chair, trying to maintain his usual air of superiority. But the smirk that had carried him through so many deals and social gatherings was gone. There was something in the tone of the letter, the precision of the words, that unsettled him. He whispered to his attorney, "This is ridiculous." She can't be serious, but even he felt the unease creeping in. The judge's expression shifted subtly. A faint smile appeared, and then, unexpectedly, he chuckled. A low, amused sound that made the courtroom turn toward him in surprise. Elena allowed herself the tiniest flicker of satisfaction. The first ripple of her plan had begun. As the judge read further, his chuckle became a full laugh, quiet at first, but steadily growing louder. The courtroom murmured, some glancing between Elena and Richard with astonishment. Friends of Richard squirmed in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, while spectators exchanged knowing smiles at his mounting embarrassment. Richard's face flushed a deep red. "Judge," he began, trying to regain control, "this is entirely inappropriate. This is a legal matter, not some comedy reading." The judge waved him off gently but firmly, still laughing under his breath. "Mr. Parker," he said, "I find that your own words have been thoroughly undermined. Miss Parker has presented not just a case, but a demonstration of foresight and intelligence that is remarkable." Elena's calmness contrasted sharply with Richard's growing frustration. He tried to interrupt, to argue that the letter was manipulative or irrelevant, but the judge's eyes held him in place. Every word from the bench reinforced the truth he had tried so hard to hide. He had underestimated his wife. The letter had achieved its primary goal. It highlighted Richard's arrogance without Elena ever needing to raise her voice. It revealed the absurdity of his smug declaration, "You'll never touch my money again," and turned it into a glaring symbol of his hubris. Spectators in the courtroom whispered, sensing the shift in power. Even Richard's attorney looked uneasy, clearly calculating the damage. Elena remained composed, her posture flawless, her gaze steady. She didn't need to gloat. The letter was doing it all for her. "Remarkable indeed," the judge said aloud, finally setting the letter down. He leaned back in his chair, shaking his head with amusement. "Miss Parker, your wit is matched only by your strategic foresight. It is rare to see a submission so precise, so cleverly crafted, and yet entirely truthful." Richard's jaw tightened. He had thought this would be a simple hearing, a demonstration of his dominance and control. Instead, he faced the reality that every ounce of his arrogance had been exposed. Every assumption about Elena's capabilities, every dismissal of her intelligence, had been proven wrong in spectacular fashion. Elena's mind was already moving forward. The laughter in the courtroom wasn't just an amusement. It was a sign. The tide had shifted and she had the upper hand. Richard's attempts at intimidation, at mockery, at dismissive gestures, all of them had failed. Even now, the judge's amusement continued, and the courtroom leaned in, eager to see what would come next. Elena allowed herself a faint smile. She had stayed patient, she had stayed calm, and now the power balance had shifted completely. Richard Parker had underestimated her, and the consequences were becoming painfully clear to everyone in the room. As the judge wiped a tear of laughter from his eye, Elena knew this was just the beginning. Her letter had done its job, humiliated Richard, earned the judge's respect, and demonstrated her intelligence. And the final moves of her plan were still to come. The courtroom was still buzzing from the judges. Laughter when Elena leaned back slightly in her seat, her hands folded calmly in her lap. Richard sat rigid across from her, his face red with embarrassment. He had expected a simple hearing, a show of dominance, a dismissal of her claims, a reaffirmation of his control. Instead, he was facing a woman who had carefully orchestrated a masterstroke in silence, but Elena was far from finished. She had saved the most potent part of her plan for this exact moment. Her lawyer, Clara, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor," she began, "Miss Parker has one final point she wishes to clarify regarding her financial situation. While Mr. Parker has repeatedly claimed that she will never touch his money again, she has, in fact, secured her own legal and financial protections, entirely independent of Mr. Parker's estate. This ensures that she is fully entitled to her rightful assets, and more importantly, demonstrates her foresight and prudence. Richard's eyes widened, a flicker of panic replacing his earlier arrogance. "Wait, what are you talking about?" he muttered under his breath, but his attorney could only shrug helplessly. Elena spoke now, her voice calm, measured, and deliberate, as if recounting an ordinary day rather than revealing a game-ending strategy. "Over the past few years," she said, "I have made legal arrangements to protect my financial independence. Investments, trusts, and accounts have been structured solely in my name in compliance with the law. These measures were taken quietly, legally, and prudently, entirely out of Mr. Parker's control." The courtroom gasped. Even the judge leaned forward, intrigued. Elena continued, never raising her voice, never showing triumph. Every word carried the weight of authority and intelligence. "Mr. Parker has repeatedly underestimated me," Elena said, looking directly at him now. "He assumed that by excluding me from his accounts, he could control my future. He assumed I would be powerless, dependent, and compliant. And yet, here I am, financially secure, legally protected, and fully prepared to assert my rights, independent of his consent or approval." Richard's mouth opened and closed, unable to find words. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, realizing the full magnitude of Elena's preparation. His arrogance had blinded him. Every boast, every declaration that she would never touch his money again had been a miscalculation. Elena had already turned his own assumptions against him. The judge nodded slowly, a mix of amusement and admiration in his aggression. "Miss Parker," he said, "it appears you have not only anticipated every claim made against you, but have also ensured your security with intelligence and foresight. This is highly impressive. It is rare to see such meticulous planning combined with such restraint." Elena allowed herself a faint smile, acknowledging the judge's words without arrogance. The courtroom now fully recognized the brilliance of her strategy. She had outsmarted Richard completely. Richard tried to speak, to assert some control over the situation, but his words stumbled. This is impossible. You can't." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Parker," he said firmly, "enough. Your wife has presented a clear, legally sound position that demonstrates both her prudence and her foresight. Your objections are moot in light of the evidence provided." Richard slumped back in his chair, defeated. The courtroom murmured in astonishment. Friends and colleagues who had once admired him now exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing the scale of his miscalculation. Elena had not only outmaneuvered him, she had exposed the fragility of his arrogance in front of everyone. Elena remained calm, poised, and dignified. She had played the long game, and it had paid off spectacularly. Her patience, intelligence, and careful preparation had transformed Richard's hubris into his undoing. As the judge prepared to continue, the energy in the room had shifted completely. The power dynamic had been reversed. Richard Parker, once so certain of his dominance, was now exposed and humiliated. And Elena Parker, serene and unshaken, had claimed victory before the final ruling had even been delivered. This was the moment she had been preparing for all along. The moment when Richard realized that underestimating her had been his greatest mistake. The courtroom was electric. Whispers spread like wildfire, and all eyes were fixed on the judge as he prepared to deliver the ruling. Elena remained calm, her hands folded in her lap, exuding the quiet confidence that had carried her through every step of this battle. Richard, in stark contrast, sat rigid, the color drained from his face. His arrogance had been replaced by disbelief, and the realization that he had underestimated his wife gnawed at him relentlessly. The judge cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses before speaking. After reviewing the evidence, the letter submitted by Ms. Parker, and the financial documentation presented, it is clear that she has acted not only with intelligence, but with foresight and prudence. Mr. Parker's attempts to exclude his wife from financial matters have been deemed invalid. Given her rightful protections and contributions, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. Richard's jaw tightened, but he attempted to mask his panic with a forced scowl. "Your Honor, with all due respect, this is preposterous," he interjected. The judge raised a hand, silencing him instantly. "Mr. Parker, your objections have been considered. However, the evidence demonstrates that your arrogance and underestimation of Miss Parker have led to this outcome. She has legally and rightfully secured her position, and any claim to dismiss her rights is therefore rejected." Richard's attorney shuffled papers nervously, clearly aware that the tide had irrevocably turned. Friends and colleagues in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats, realizing that the man who had always seemed untouchable was now exposed. Elena remained composed, her expression serene. She did not smile excessively, nor did she gloat. Her presence alone was enough to assert the victory she had earned. Every detail, every careful plan, every patient move had culminated in this moment. The courtroom recognized her intelligence and her calm authority. The judge continued. "In addition to recognizing Ms. Parker's rightful financial claims, I would also commend her for the manner in which she presented herself. She has maintained composure, respect, and strategic clarity throughout these proceedings. This is rare in cases of this nature, and it speaks volumes about her character." Richard's face turned a deep shade of crimson. He had expected a simple victory, a routine hearing in which he could assert dominance and dismiss his wife's claims. Instead, he had been publicly outmaneuvered. The humiliation was palpable. His friends exchanged awkward glances, some hiding smirks, others openly shaking their heads at his downfall. Elena rose when the judge finally adjourned the hearing. Her movements were smooth and deliberate, radiating calm triumph. Each step she took toward the exit was a silent reminder of her control, her intelligence, and her patience. Richard attempted to follow, perhaps to argue one final time, but the judge's gavel silenced him outside the courtroom. Elena was met with quiet nods of respect and a few murmured congratulations from spectators who had witnessed the spectacle. Richard lingered, struggling to maintain any semblance of dignity. But the world had seen the truth. He had underestimated Elena, and the consequences were severe. Elena's allies, Maya and Mr. Harris, fell into step beside her. "You did it," Maya whispered, her eyes shining with admiration. "I did more than that," Elena replied softly, her voice calm and assured. "I proved that patience, preparation, and intelligence can outmatch arrogance every time." Richard remained behind, isolated and humiliated. The man who had once declared that Elena would never touch his money again was left powerless, exposed, and defeated. His smirk, once a shield of confidence, had evaporated entirely. As Elena walked out of the courthouse, sunlight spilling over her shoulders, she felt a wave of relief and triumph. The victory was not just financial, it was personal. She had reclaimed control over her life, her dignity, and her future. The courtroom had witnessed the rise of a woman who had been underestimated, mocked and dismissed, and had emerged victorious. Calm and uncheckable, for Elena Parker, the battle had ended not with anger, but with precision. Her patience had paid off, her intelligence had triumphed, and her quiet, calculated moves had left a man who thought himself untouchable utterly defeated. The courthouse in the late afternoon was quieter now, the hustle of spectators having faded, leaving behind an echo of the day's dramatic events. Elena Parker walked out onto the sunlit steps. The city skyline stretched before her, sharp and bright against the pale winter sky. She drew in a deep breath, the crisp air feeling like a cleansing wave after months of tension, planning, and silent anticipation. Richard Parker had left earlier, his departure quiet, accompanied by the murmurs of onlookers who had witnessed his complete humiliation. The arrogance that had once filled every room he entered was gone, replaced by a thin mask of dignity that could barely conceal his shame. Elena allowed herself no triumph in his absence. She didn't need it. The satisfaction lay elsewhere, in the knowledge that she had prepared, planned, and executed every move with precision. She met Maya and Mr. Harris at the foot of the steps, and the three of them shared a quiet moment of acknowledgement. Maya's eyes sparkled with pride. "You were incredible," she said softly. He never saw it coming. And the judge. "I've never seen anyone read a letter and laugh like that before." Elena smiled faintly. "It wasn't just the letter," she replied. "It was preparation, patience, staying calm when he expected a fight, letting his arrogance do the work for me." Mr. Harris nodded. "Most people rush to anger to outshout their opponent. But you did something far more effective. You made him underestimate you, then used every advantage he gave you without even realizing it." Elena let the words settle over her, savoring the quiet power of the moment. For years, she had been told she was too soft, too naive, too compliant. She had smiled, nodded, and endured while Richard claimed credit for victories she had quietly orchestrated. But now, she had reclaimed her narrative entirely. Weeks passed, and Elena settled into her new routine. The legal proceedings had concluded, the settlement finalized, and her finances were fully secured. She no longer needed to rely on Richard in any capacity, not for money, influence, or validation. Her investments were hers alone, her future protected, and her independence absolute. Richard, meanwhile, faded into whispers and speculation. Friends and colleagues who had once praised his brilliance now questioned his judgment, shaking their heads at how a woman he dismissed could so thoroughly outmaneuver him. For Elena, this was not a moment of cruelty, but of quiet satisfaction. The man who had declared she would never touch his money again had been proven wrong in the most definitive way possible. One crisp morning, Elena sat at her desk in her new apartment, a notebook open before her. She began to write, not a letter of revenge, but a reflection, a record of her strength, patience, and intelligence. She wanted to remember how carefully she had planned, how she had stayed calm under pressure, and how she had turned what others had assumed was weakness into her greatest weapon. "He thought he could lock me out of his world," she wrote. "He believed my silence was submission. Little did he know I had been writing the rules all along." As she closed the notebook, Elena felt a deep sense of peace. Victory, she realized, was not about humiliation or anger. It was about strategy, dignity, and knowing one's own worth. She had proven in the most undeniable way that patience, intelligence, and composure could triumph over arrogance, greed, and hubris. Looking out over the city, Elena smiled again. She had not just reclaimed her assets, she had reclaimed herself. The world might remember Richard Parker as a wealthy man humbled in court, but she remembered him as the catalyst for her greatest triumph. And with that thought, she poured herself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and let herself enjoy the quiet, absolute satisfaction of a plan executed perfectly. The chapter of humiliation was closed. The chapter of independence, wisdom, and resilience had only just begun. Elena Parker, underestimated for too long, had finally taken her rightful place, not as a shadow behind a man, but as a force entirely her own.